Pastor David Martinez stood in the doorway of St. Mary's Community Church, watching the morning sun filter through cracked, stained glass windows that hadn't been repaired in decades. The building bore the scars of urban decay, peeling paint, worn carpets, and a heating system that wheezed through Chicago's brutal winters. Yet beneath the surface deterioration lay something beautiful, a thriving community of hope. For 3 years, the church basement had served as an overnight shelter for homeless families, transforming cold concrete floors into a sanctuary of warmth and dignity. David had started the shelter program after finding an elderly veteran frozen to death on their front steps one February morning. The image of that man's weathered face had haunted his dreams, driving him to ensure no one else would perish in the shadow of God's house. Now 12 families called the basement home each night, single mothers with young children, elderly couples who had lost everything to medical bills, and working families whose minimum wage jobs couldn't cover Chicago's soaring rent prices. The shelter wasn't just emergency housing, it had become a place where broken lives were slowly pieced back together through compassion, community support, and the radical belief that every person possessed inherent worth and dignity. The morning that would change everything began deceptively ordinary. David was reviewing the week's food distribution schedule when the expensive black sedan pulled into the church parking lot, its pristine paint job contrasting sharply with the neighborhood's weathered buildings. Margaret Chen, chairwoman of the Chicago Metropolitan Church Council, emerged wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than David's monthly salary. Behind her, 2 men in expensive suits surveyed the modest church with calculating expressions, their presence immediately commanding attention in the humble space. Margaret's smile was warm and practiced as she approached, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum floors with authoritative precision. She spoke of divine timing and God's mysterious ways. But David sensed something beneath her honeyed words, an agenda that made his stomach tighten with inexplicable apprehension. Her companions remained silent, taking notes on tablets while photographing various aspects of the building's interior. The atmosphere felt more like a business assessment than a pastoral visit, and David's 15 years of ministry had taught him to be wary of unexpected visits from church hierarchy, especially when they arrived with such obvious preparation and purpose. Margaret settled into David's modest office, her eyes quickly cataloguing the second-hand furniture, outdated computer, and walls lined with thank you cards from grateful shelter residents. She spoke with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted, weaving spiritual language through what increasingly felt like a carefully rehearsed sales presentation. David listened politely, but unease crept up his spine as she mentioned exciting opportunities and God's perfect timing with theatrical emphasis. "David, the Metropolitan Council has been watching your work here with great interest," she began, leaning forward with manufactured intimacy. "We've decided to offer you something extraordinary, the pastoral position at New Covenant Cathedral." The words hit David like a physical blow. New Covenant Cathedral was the crown jewel of Chicago's religious landscape, a gleaming 10,000-seat megachurch with a television ministry reaching millions worldwide. The senior pastor position was the kind of opportunity that ministry professionals dreamed about their entire careers: unlimited resources, international influence, and a salary that would transform his family's modest lifestyle into something approaching luxury. Yet Margaret's tone carried undertones that suggested this incredible blessing came with conditions, and David's instincts warned him that gifts appearing too perfect often demanded prices too high to pay. The tour of New Covenant Cathedral felt like stepping into another universe entirely. Gleaming marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than St. Mary's annual operating budget. State-of-the-art sound systems, high-definition video screens, and technology that seemed borrowed from science fiction filled every corner of the massive facility. Margaret painted vivid pictures of possibilities that made David's head spin. Youth programs serving thousands, community outreach initiatives with unlimited funding, global missions projects that could change entire regions, educational opportunities that would rival major universities. As they walked through executive offices larger than his entire church, David's imagination soared with visions of the impact he could achieve with such incredible resources. The children's ministry alone operated with a budget exceeding what he currently spent on everything combined. The worship center's pipe organ had been handcrafted in Germany at astronomical expense, creating sounds that seemed to transport listeners directly into heaven's throne room. Every detail spoke of excellence, influence, and the kind of ministry platform that could amplify his message to unprecedented levels. But when they reached the boardroom overlooking the city skyline, Margaret's tone subtly shifted. She began speaking about the church's reputation, its standing among Chicago's elite, and the expectations that accompanied such a prestigious position. The weight of her implications settled over David like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. The boardroom's polished mahogany table reflected Margaret's confident expression as she outlined the position's extraordinary benefits. The salary alone would be 10 times his current income, enough to eliminate every financial worry that had plagued his family for years. His wife Sarah could finally quit her exhausting second job cleaning offices at night. His daughter Emily could attend the prestigious private academy she'd dreamed of, opening doors to opportunities David had never dared imagine. His aging mother could receive the specialized medical care her deteriorating condition desperately required, treatments currently beyond their financial reach. Margaret spread glossy promotional materials across the table, each page showcasing the cathedral's impressive ministries, community influence, and global reach. She spoke of book deals, speaking engagements, and television appearances that would establish David as a recognized religious leader. The benefits package included luxury housing, vehicle allowances, and retirement contributions that would secure his family's future for generations. It was everything he had never allowed himself to want, presented as God's reward for years of faithful service in obscurity. Then Margaret's expression grew serious, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering necessary but unpleasant news. Of course, accepting this position would require closing the homeless shelter program at St. Mary's. The Metropolitan Council has significant development plans for that property, and housing transients simply doesn't align with our community improvement initiatives. The words struck David like ice water, instantly transforming the meeting's warm atmosphere into something cold and calculating. David's coffee cup trembled in his hands as Margaret continued explaining the transition process with businesslike efficiency. The homeless families would receive 2 weeks' notice, a generous timeline, she assured him, given that most similar situations allowed only days. Social services would be contacted to help relocate the residents, though she admitted that city resources were severely limited and waiting lists extended for months. The church building itself would be demolished within 6 months to make way for luxury condominiums, part of an ambitious neighborhood gentrification project that promised to revitalize the district's economic potential. Or, as Margaret spoke with casual indifference about displacing 12 families, David's mind filled with faces and stories. Maria Santos, who worked 2 cleaning jobs while studying for her GED, trying to create a better future for her 3 young children. Elderly Robert Chen, a Korean War veteran whose medical bankruptcy had cost him his home after 60 years of faithful citizenship. The Johnson family, whose father had been laid off when the factory closed, desperately seeking work while their savings evaporated. These weren't statistics or policy problems. They were real people who had entrusted their lives to his care, finding safety and dignity in the church's humble basement. Margaret seemed to interpret his silence as concern about logistics rather than moral anguish. She assured him that proper procedures would be followed, paperwork filed correctly, and that the church's insurance would cover any potential liabilities during the transition period. Her clinical approach to human displacement revealed the vast philosophical chasm between their understandings of ministry's fundamental purpose. The drive back to St. Mary's stretched endlessly as Margaret's words echoed through David's mind like accusations. 6-figure salary. Emily's educational dreams fulfilled. His mother's medical needs met. Sarah's exhaustion finally relieved. Every practical consideration screamed acceptance, yet underneath these rational arguments, David heard other voices. The soft prayers of gratitude from families who had nowhere else to turn, the laughter of children playing games in the shelter's common area, the whispered conversations of people slowly rebuilding shattered lives through the simple gift of stability and community acceptance. As he pulled into the church's cracked parking lot, 10-year-old Carlos Santos was kicking a soccer ball against the building's brick wall, his gap-toothed grin lighting up when he spotted David's ancient Honda Civic. The boy ran over excitedly, chattering about his math test success and asking if they could practice reading together after dinner. Carlos had been living in the shelter with his mother and baby sister for 8 months. Slowly healing from the trauma of eviction and homelessness. His innocent enthusiasm pierced through David's swirling thoughts like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. This wasn't merely about buildings, programs, or administrative decisions. Real people had placed their trust in his promise that God's house would always offer sanctuary to those whom society had forgotten. Their faces told stories of resilience, hope, and the transformative power of unconditional acceptance in a world that too often measured human worth by economic productivity. David found Sarah hunched over their kitchen table that evening, surrounded by stacks of medical bills, past due notices, and insurance forms that seemed to multiply like invasive weeds. Her shoulders carried the weight of financial stress that had become their constant unwelcome companion over the past several months. Dark circles under her eyes testified to countless nights spent balancing impossible budgets, trying to stretch every dollar beyond its natural limits. When David shared news of the cathedral position, her transformation was immediate and heartbreaking, hope flooding her features like sunrise after the longest night. "David, this could be the answer we've been praying for," she whispered, reaching across the table to grasp his hands with desperate intensity. "Emily could finally attend that academy she talks about constantly. Your mother could get those experimental treatments the insurance company keeps denying. I could quit that horrible night job and maybe finish my teaching degree." Her words painted pictures of possibilities that had lived only in their most private dreams. Family vacations, college funds, home ownership, medical security, and the simple dignity of financial stability. But when Sarah asked about the transition details and David explained the shelter's closure requirement, her expression crumbled like sandcastles meeting inevitable tide. She had volunteered in the shelter countless evenings, reading bedtime stories to frightened children, teaching basic computer skills to job-seeking adults, and offering the kind of maternal comfort that only someone who understood struggle could provide. The moral weight of Margaret's condition settled between them like an unwelcome third presence, transforming celebration into agonizing contemplation. Sleep proved impossible as David wandered through the empty church at midnight, his footsteps echoing in the darkness like prayers seeking direction. The building felt different in the silence, more sacred somehow, as if God's presence concentrated more intensely when human noise subsided. He descended the worn stairs to the basement shelter where 12 families slept peacefully in spaces that had been transformed through love, creativity, and determination into something approaching home. Cardboard dividers provided privacy between bedrooms. Donated blankets offered warmth against Chicago's bitter cold, and hope existed in the smallest gestures of human dignity maintained despite devastating circumstances. In one corner, Maria Santos sat beside her feverish 4-year-old daughter, gently stroking the child's hair while humming a Spanish lullaby her own grandmother had sung decades ago in a village whose name was becoming distant memory. The scene broke something fundamental inside David's chest, a reminder that his calling had never been about personal advancement, institutional recognition, or professional achievement. Ministry meant serving those whom society's economic machinery had discarded, offering sanctuary to people whose only crime was lacking sufficient resources to maintain housing in America's increasingly expensive cities. Each sleeping face told stories of resilience that humbled him. These families weren't statistics or social problems requiring administrative solutions. They were individuals created in God's image, temporarily displaced by circumstances largely beyond their control, finding restoration through a community that had chosen radical hospitality over comfortable isolation. Morning brought an unexpected visitor whose presence immediately lightened David's burden of solitary decision-making. Bishop Thomas Wright, his former seminary mentor and the man whose passionate sermons had first inspired David to abandon a promising business career for ministry, stood in the church doorway with his familiar warm smile and eyes that seemed to perceive truths hidden from ordinary observation. Thomas had driven 3 hours after hearing through the ecclesiastical grapevine about David's impossible choice, arriving unannounced, but exactly when his guidance was most desperately needed. Over coffee in David's modest office, the elderly bishop listened with the patient attention that had made him legendary among struggling pastors throughout the Midwest. His weathered hands held decades of similar moral dilemmas, his lined face reflecting countless nights spent wrestling with the tension between practical necessity and prophetic calling. Thomas asked penetrating questions that forced David to examine his motivations with uncomfortable honesty. Questions about success, faithfulness, legacy, and the true nature of God's call on his life. Success in ministry, Thomas finally said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom accumulated through 50 years of pastoral service, isn't measured by congregation size, building magnificence, or salary figures. It's measured by faithfulness to those who need you most desperately, especially when that faithfulness demands significant personal sacrifice. His words cut through David's confusion, like lighthouse beams piercing fog, illuminating truths that had been obscured by the dazzling promise of cathedral ministry and financial security. The remainder of that day transformed into an unexpected revelation as David observed the shelter's daily rhythms with newly awakened awareness. He watched residents helping each other prepare for job interviews, sharing clothing and offering encouragement with genuine generosity despite their own precarious circumstances. Children completed homework assignments at donated desks while older residents provided patient tutoring, creating an impromptu educational community that functioned better than many well-funded programs. Volunteers arrived throughout the day, retired teachers offering literacy classes, local nurses providing basic health care, teenagers from suburban churches learning about urban poverty through direct service rather than abstract discussion. This wasn't merely emergency housing or temporary crisis intervention. It was a functioning community where broken lives were being reconstructed through the radical practice of unconditional acceptance and mutual support. People who had been invisible to mainstream society found voices, dignity, and purpose within these humble basement walls. Former residents frequently returned as volunteers, their lives stabilized enough to offer assistance to newer arrivals facing similar challenges. The transformation was organic, sustainable, and powerful in ways that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics of institutional success. When evening gathering time arrived, David looked into the trusting faces of shelter residents and realized that closing this program wouldn't simply displace 12 families. It would destroy a miracle that God had constructed through ordinary people, choosing extraordinary compassion over comfortable indifference. The weight of that revelation settled into his bones like fundamental truth, reshaping his understanding of ministry's essential purpose. Margaret had scheduled their final meeting for Friday morning, providing David with 3 agonizing days to wrestle with the most consequential decision of his ministry career. He spent those 72 hours in intensive prayer, seeking counsel from trusted advisors and examining his calling's deepest foundations through scripture study and meditation. The practical considerations remained overwhelmingly persuasive. His family's legitimate financial needs, his mother's deteriorating health condition, Emily's educational opportunities, and Sarah's exhausting work schedule that was slowly destroying her physical and emotional well-being. Every rational calculation pointed toward accepting Margaret's offer, yet David found himself repeatedly returning to the shelter's basement, observing interactions that revealed kingdom principles operating in their purest form. Wednesday evening brought a breakthrough moment when Carlos Santos approached him with a crayon drawing depicting the church as a house with many rooms, each filled with smiling faces, representing the diverse family that had formed within these walls. The child's innocent artwork captured something profound about incarnational ministry that no seminary course had adequately conveyed. Thursday night provided final clarity when David sat with Sarah and Emily during bedtime prayers. Their 8-year-old daughter asked a question that pierced through every rationalization with childlike directness. "Daddy, if we help people because God loves them, why would God want us to stop helping them to get more money?" Her innocent inquiry exposed the fundamental contradiction in Margaret's proposal, revealing the impossibility of advancing God's kingdom through actions that abandoned God's people. Friday morning arrived with autumn rain drumming against the church windows, like urgent fingers tapping out divine Morse code. David dressed carefully, understanding that this meeting would define not merely his career trajectory, but his character's deepest foundations and his family's legacy for generations to come. In the sanctuary's quiet darkness, he knelt before the simple wooden cross that had witnessed countless prayers, confessions, celebrations, and moments of profound spiritual transformation. The silence spoke more clearly than any sermon, confirming what his heart had known from the beginning. When Margaret arrived with her encouraging smile, leather portfolio, and final contract documents, David was prepared with a peace that surprised him with its completeness. His voice remained steady as he spoke words that felt both terrifying and liberating. "Margaret, I'm deeply grateful for the extraordinary honor you've offered me, but I cannot accept the cathedral position under these conditions." Her practiced composure cracked slightly as she asked if he fully understood the magnitude of what he was rejecting. The influence, the resources, the opportunities that might never come again. "Yes," David replied, his calm demeanor reflecting an inner certainty that had crystallized through days of agonizing contemplation. "I understand exactly what I would be giving up. But more importantly, I understand what I would be giving up if I accepted your offer. Some prices are simply too high to pay, regardless of what we might gain in return." Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching respect as she gathered her materials, perhaps recognizing authentic conviction when confronted with it directly. 6 months later, St. Mary's Community Church had evolved into something neither David nor anyone else had anticipated during those dark days of decision. Word of his choice had spread through Chicago's religious and social justice communities, attracting volunteers, donors, and advocates from across the metropolitan area who were inspired by authentic faith translated into concrete action. The shelter program had expanded to serve 20 families nightly, with additional daytime services including job training, childcare, and educational support that addressed root causes of homelessness rather than merely managing its symptoms. The congregation had grown organically as people were drawn to a church that prioritized compassion over comfort, service over success, and radical hospitality over institutional prestige. David's salary remained modest, but the richness of purpose filled gaps that money could never bridge. Corporate donations, foundation grants, and individual contributions had funded building repairs, program expansion, and community partnerships that were transforming the entire neighborhood through practical expressions of kingdom values. As David watched Carlos Santos teaching younger children to read in the newly renovated church library, he reflected on the mysterious nature of divine economics, where apparent losses become unexpected gains. Margaret's offer had seemed like providential blessing, but sometimes God's greatest gifts arrive disguised as sacrifices that initially appear costly but ultimately prove invaluable. The path he had chosen led not to fame, fortune, or institutional recognition, but to something infinitely more valuable, a ministry built on love rather than ambition, service rather than status, and faithfulness rather than success, as the world defines it. Thank you for listening to this story of faith, courage, and discovering the true meaning of pastoral calling. In the comments below, please share where you're listening from around the world. We love connecting with our global community. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us what really matters in life.